pick things. There you go. Pick things up and introduce Bente and.
Certainly.
Okay.
Let's see. One thing I forgot to mention to Bente, I reached out to Darcy Kitchen had mentioned that she knows you and she wanted to say hi to you, Bente. I'm not sure if you.
Okay. Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, right. All right. So let's see. It's a pleasure to have Bente Birkeland with us to talk today, and just want to say that she's a longtime journalist with a lot of experience, and currently she's with the Colorado Public Radio, and she's here to talk about resiliency and related issues from a legislative perspective, past, present, and future. Given all the experience she has covering with the Colorado Capitol and the Colorado legislature, I should say. And she's a very award-winning journalist. She joined CPR, Colorado Public Radio, in 2018. After a decade of reporting on the Colorado State Capitol for the Rocky Mountain Community Radio Collaborative and KUNC, which is up in northern Colorado. She covers state politics and policy stories on a range of topics, and she frequently collaborates with NPR, which is National Public Radio. And in 2017, Bente was named Colorado Journalist of the Year by the Society of Professional Journalists. And she was awarded with a National Investigative Reporting Award by the same organization, SPJ, a year later. She also won an Edgar R. Murrow Award in 2015 for her work on KRCC's series on the Southwest Chief Railroad, Railroad West. And throughout her career, Bente has been honored with various accolades from the Colorado Broadcasters Association, the Murrow Awards, the Association of State House Reporter and Editors, and the Third Coast International Audio Festival, and the US Department of Justice. So Bente has a really impressive record. And so she's just want to say, add a note. So she's going to talk with us, share some things with us. And if we have questions to ask of her, there'll be a question time afterwards. If you have a very pressing question, a pertinent question, you might be able to ask it during her presentation. So anyway, here's Bente, and we're in for a good talk, I would say.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining. It was interesting when Michael first reached out about talking about resiliency. I kind of thought, like, what am I going to say on this topic? Just because I've never really thought about the legislative coverage I've done under that frame of resiliency. And I have been covering the Capitol for quite a while now, which it doesn't, some days it feels like it's been forever. And some days it feels like I kind of just started, because you're always learning something new and kind of sometimes thrown into an uncertain situation that you didn't anticipate, and kind of can be scrambling on any given day. So I think it's an interesting lens to think about my work at the Capitol and other journalists, framing what we do for those of us who do cover, state government, politics, political campaigns, and then state policies as they're being implemented. When I think of resiliency, I guess what comes to mind for me would be just handling adversity and kind of getting through a tough situation, persevering despite the obstacles, or maybe in the face of obstacles. And I think that's obviously going to look like different for each person, and depending upon what you're facing, and I mean, so many other things go into that. I would say the state capitol it's a unique environment. I mean, it's much different than Congress, where people are spread out a little bit more, and when people are voting, at least in the U.S. House, lawmakers come and go and vote, and they're usually not all in the chamber together. But here at our Capitol, from January to May, which is our legislative session, 4 months, the lawmakers are all in the building together with members of the media, lobbyists, whoever's walking through in the public. On the chamber floor, the media is allowed to be at a press table. So we're all kind of, sometimes it feels like trapped in that building, whether it's a late night hearing that goes to 2 or 3 in the morning, and then we're back there the next day at 9. It kind of, each session has its own rhythm for the people who are there every day, covering it and being a part of it. And I think one thing I've learned is, we expect the unexpected, especially when it comes to the Capitol. We don't know how things are ever going to play out. And as I was thinking about it, I think the topic of resiliency, issues tied to that really does come up a lot at the Capitol, although maybe not explicitly. So I think, for instance, this next legislative session, which starts January 12th, one of the main focuses will be, in a way, resiliency and pandemic recovery. A big part of that focus will be how to spend the nearly $4 billion the state is receiving in federal COVID relief. And so lawmakers in both political parties, they're aware that because we have healthy state revenues from income and sales taxes, and then this massive federal COVID relief spending, it's leading up to this once in a generation opportunity to make these key investments and to help the state bounce back as much as possible from the pandemic, and grapple with some of the effects of what Colorado's experienced in recent years. And so that's one thing I'm looking at. In the near term, there was a bipartisan task force, various task force of lawmakers to draft legislation, and lawmakers and the governor is working closely with them in both parties on 4 key areas, and it's economic recovery, workforce development and education, housing and home ownership, and then behavioral health. And with the behavioral health and mental health task force, they're going to be issuing a report in January with policy recommendations. And so I talked to one of the representatives from Boulder, actually, Judy Amabile, a Democrat in the House, and she said her top goal is to make sure there's expanded hospital beds for mental health and addiction treatment and recovery. And this is something the state's been grappling with for quite a while, but the pandemic has made things a lot worse for behavioral health of all ages. And separate from this task force, last session, the state set aside $10 million of federal money to allow every school-age child to get up to 3 mental health appointments, transitioning back to in-person school. That's been delayed, trying to get a vendor and things like that. So those appointments were supposed to happen last summer, and that didn't come to fruition. So they're still working on that. And I'm hearing anecdotally, and some of you are probably aware of this too, that there's a lack of staff. There's a shortage of workers in this particular field. So that's one thing we're tracking as this money flows out. Is it going where it's intended to go? Can it be implemented in a timely fashion? Is it, how effective is it? There was a bill during a special session a year ago to try to get money to small businesses hard hit by the pandemic, and they kind of rushed the bill through, and it turns out the state auditor looked at those funds, and 60% of the funds never went out to the small businesses. And there were issues about businesses qualifying for those funds, and there's a lot of bureaucratic hurdles that can get in the way. So I think that's one thing we will have to focus on as journalists. And there's $4 billion. Where is it going, and what is the impact there? I think that this is one fairly broad area of bipartisanship, focusing in these 4 separate areas. I don't know if they'll all agree on every bill that comes out of it, but generally in Colorado, the budgeting process, for the most part, is pretty bipartisan. And passing a balanced budget is the only thing the state legislature is required to do under the Constitution. And so they do get that done. It is balanced, and a lot of times it has plenty of Republicans and Democrats, focused on that. So I think mental health and personal resiliency in youth, that will play a big role in the session. Coming up this next year, also we have all the political dynamic, and you can't separate the politics from the policy because one influences the other. And so we have quite a few lawmakers running for US Congress because of redistricting, our once in a decade process for the new political lines. Every lawmaker will be running in a new seat. Some people are drawn out of seats or may have to primary someone in their party. People went from safe seats to less safe seats. And then we have, I think it's 3 out of the 4 legislative leaders will be term limited. So next year we'll have new legislative leaders. So there's just a lot going on, especially when redistricting only happens once every 10 years. It will have a big influence on the session, even if it's not an explicit influence. Also the governor running for re-election and all the statewide offices. So we'll be balancing that with the big policy questions they have to decide and the different viewpoints we have from lawmakers, whether it's a message bill that isn't going to pass, but you want to still have a public discussion about it, or you're introducing a bill to put someone else in a politically tough spot because then they may have to take a position on something, versus some lawmakers who know it's going to be their last year and last session and they really just want to get some things done. And others maybe want to take a more cautious approach based on what their district looks like. So, there's always a lot of different factors pulling on lawmakers and the session. And I don't think that's changed over the years. I think we've always had that. It's just each session is different. And I think the mood nationally, how toxic and divisive it can be, will sometimes, can start to influence lawmakers at the State House. And with COVID, they haven't had as much time to hang out and kind of go to events together, which I think can break down some of those barriers, even if you're not really good friends with someone, just seeing them in a more casual setting or at a luncheon, or it can increase that personal rapport that when you disagree, you may disagree in a more pleasant way versus a way that kind of derails things. So I had a piece kind of lined up to play. I'm switching it. The piece I was going to play is it's tied to behavioral health. It was a bill they worked on last session on high THC and marijuana, and trying to reduce the amount of access teens had to this product. And that's something that people are focused on in Colorado and nationally, as some of the marijuana concentrates that a lot of people are using are 80% THC. So it's much, much different than the flower traditionally people might think of someone smoking pot. So that was one piece I was going to play you, but I've decided on another one now, which is kind of this idea, going back to resiliency, that situations can get kind of tense and maybe things are going to be derailed. And then I have seen time and time again, lawmakers in the legislature bring things back on track and somehow get through situations that you think, how is this gonna all shake out? And this is one that's kind of it's like a fun story, but it really wasn't a fun story when we were in the middle of it. And some of you may remember this, and if you don't, it was a couple years ago. I did it for us, and I did it story for NPR as well. And I'm going to play it. It was a story. It's called "Colorado Legislators Are in the Middle of a Lengthy Political Fight." And this is an example of something none of us saw coming until it happened. And I'm just going to share my screen here, and I'll be able to share the audio. Yes, share sound. Okay. I'm going to play this right now.
Hey NPR, this holiday season,
about that.
NPR Music invites you to get in the spirit to celebrate with a collection of your favorite holiday-themed Tiny Desk concerts. Click to watch the videos now and spread the love by sharing with a friend. Support for NPR comes from the 2021 lead sponsor of NPR Music, State Farm. Like a good neighbor, State Farm is there.
Okay.
This next story starts with a short history lesson. When Colorado became a state in 1876, not every lawmaker could read. So the state constitution required that all bills be read on the floor out loud and in full. Since then, the provision has been amended slightly. Lawmakers have had little use for it until now. Bente Birkeland of Colorado Public Radio reports.
In November, Democrats in Colorado won big. After taking the House, Senate, and the governor's mansion, they set out with an ambitious agenda: stricter oil and gas regulations, paid family leave, a red flag gun law. That doesn't sit well with Republicans, who say Democrats are moving too quickly on big bills. To slow down their opponents and the process, they're employing that old tactic: asking bills to be read out loud in full.
Senator Cook. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I also move House Bill 1172 and ask that it be read at length.
I object to the motion and ask that the journal be read at length.
So I respectfully request that Senate Bill 99 be read at length.
Chris Holbert is Colorado's Senate Republican minority leader. He says there just isn't much else his party can do.
The only thing that we have as leverage in the minority, when both chambers are in the minority, is having bills read at length.
One of those bills was 2,000 pages long. To read out loud, it would have taken Senate staff a week. Democratic Senate President Leroy Garcia says during that time, no other Senate business could have been accomplished.
I see my colleagues from the other side reverting to Trump-like tactics and the style of Washington, D.C., and it's not Colorado. It's not what people send us here to do.
So in order to speed things along, Garcia brought in a bank of 5 computers to read the bill at 650 words per minute. It was a truly bizarre sound on the Senate floor.
We have to be responsible and continue to get the work of the people done.
But that's not the end of the story. Republicans then sued Garcia for violating the at-length provision of the Constitution. The Senate's rules don't say anything explicitly about whether a bill reading must be understandable, but a Denver district court sided with the GOP and says bill readings have to be intelligible.
If they're complaining about reading a bill, that's on them.
That's Republican State Senator Owen Hill. After the court's decision, he's requested various bills be read at length. He says it's to help bring his party to the negotiating table.
We need to slow things down and have better deliberation about all of these big changes.
His efforts may be starting to work. Senate Democrats signed off on his idea to put more money for transportation into the state budget, a top priority for Republicans. But Democrats in both chambers are not on board with this delay tactic and are appealing the judge's decision. 2 years ago, the Mississippi Supreme Court threw out a similar case, citing separation of powers. Colorado's House Speaker Casey Becker says much of her party's agenda could be in jeopardy.
It's a purely obstructionist move that the Denver District Court just completely enabled. And so it's a complete overreach because it's really within the General Assembly's purview to interpret our rules and how we do business.
And now Republicans in the House are regularly asking for bills to be read. But trying to play by the court's rules, Democrats in that chamber are using just one computer.
In any of the cases identified in subsection 1 of this section 17 in which the initial complaint, petition, or other commencing pleading 18 does not disclose.
For NPR News, I'm Bente Birkeland in Denver.
So I just played that as an example of, it was, at the time, it was odd to have, obviously, that chipmunky sound, covering the whole Capitol. And it seemed kind of like, oh, this is, people at the time were saying, oh, this is kind of a funny situation, but it did almost derail the whole legislative agenda. And the tension it caused in the Senate, especially when Republicans sued the Senate president, it was one of the tenser moments I've seen in my years there. There's plenty, but I'd put it in that top 10 or so, 5 or 10. But they did actually work through this. The Supreme Court ultimately did side with Republicans and said it has to be intelligible. So now for these bill readings, they'll use a high-speed computer, but just one computer. So it still goes pretty quickly, faster than an individual reading it. But it's a tactic because Republicans are still in the minority in both chambers that we may see play out, especially at the end of session when, it's a 120-day session. So the timeline does matter as the clock starts ticking in those final days, because you only have a certain number of time to move bills through. So, but I think that the leaders that were involved with that situation, I think they did work through it. They have a pretty okay working relationship now, and they kind of came back from that brink of where it all seemed like it was kind of falling apart that session. And I think they've had to do a lot in terms of working together to figure out how they're going to handle kind of adversity. And it's especially, last, March when COVID first hit, they paused the session, not knowing when they were going to come back. They chose a return date that ended up being the day after George Floyd was murdered. So, and then most of the protests and things were starting from the state capitol. So they were dealing kind of with the COVID restrictions, whether or not people would wear masks. And, that was very controversial, and just what the policies were going to be like inside the building. And then protests, some vandalism of the Capitol building, and then just the national mood of what was going on with criminal justice and that type of thing. So, that's just a few thoughts. I have another piece I was going to play, but I'll just pause if there's any questions about anything so far. And if not, I can just, keep going on this. So I think some of the things we've seen, with resiliency also, I wouldn't say they always fall on party lines, but I think it's something that a lot of lawmakers are thinking about, whether it's making students resilient, or the state, or businesses, or healthy economy. Coming out of things like the mass shooting in Boulder, there was a lot of discussion about how to kind of respond and recover and try to prevent something like this from happening again. And as everyone is aware, a lot of different views on what's appropriate and what's the best response. But lawmakers did follow up with legislation there on some of the things were already in the works, like you have to report a lost and stolen firearm. You have to safely store a firearm, and kind of restricting when someone can purchase a firearm, what kind of background checks and what things would trigger you not being able to purchase a firearm. And then setting up an office of gun violence prevention, I think is the name, that is going to research different things related to gun violence. So I think we'll see some of that this session. I've talked to lawmakers who do want to focus, Democrats who want to focus on criminal justice reform. At the same time, there's crime rates are going up, and the governor talked about prioritizing reducing crime. So I don't know how that's going to necessarily, they're not necessarily the same thing, but a lot of times they get grouped together. So that's another thing we'll be following this session. And just, I think we will see a cycle where Republicans pick up seats. In the House, Republicans only have 24 seats. It's a 65-member chamber, so they're pretty deeply in the minority, but they think they'll pick up a few more seats, not enough to overturn that chamber. I've covered the legislature quite a few years when it was split legislative control. A lot of the years when John Hickenlooper was governor, the chambers were controlled by different parties, which also makes for a unique dynamic. And not as many states have split legislative control. And in the state Senate, Democrats have a 5-seat majority. So we may see, we'll see that being in play. Whether Republicans can take that, I don't know. So I do think a lot of the lawmakers care about the policies. And I think for the most part, they're running for office because they do want to improve the lives of Coloradans, make the state better. And there's quite a few things they'll agree on, but of course on the big contentious issues, that's just going to be hard. And so another piece I'm going to play, this was from last session, and there's been, there's just a fundamental disagreement about what systemic racism means and how to handle that, how it's used in policy discussions. And it's a fairly partisan discussion, and I think that we're going to see that play out even more this next session. So I'm going to play one more piece, and then happy to take more questions about this session or anything kind of tied to resiliency. So I'm going to share this here.
How state lawmakers talk about race and how they talk to each other has been causing tension at the state capitol this year. They're working on having tough but respectful conversations. CPR's Bente Birkeland has more.
The state capitol has a lot of rules about decorum, when people can speak, how people can speak. And lawmakers in the House have crossed those boundaries this year a lot, with name-calling, interruptions, and heckling. Democratic House Speaker Alec Garnett recently asked his colleagues for a reset.
There have been some challenged moments where racist, discriminatory words have been uttered that have really hurt Coloradans and members of the General Assembly. Those have been challenges, but I believe that we can do better.
One of the most notable incidents happened earlier this month on the House floor during a heated debate. Republican Representative Richard Holtorf responded to heckling from his Democratic colleague David Ortiz, who was Latino. Holtorf then called him buckwheat, a racially insensitive term based on a caricature of a black child from the early 20th century.
I'm getting there. Don't worry, buckwheat. I'm getting there. Now, what I'd like to say, that's an endearing term, by the way.
Representative Holtorf.
Holtorf has since apologized to his colleagues for the remark. He told CPR he did not know the racial history or context behind the term. He did acknowledge that he never should have talked pejoratively to Representative Ortiz. But Holtorf says he also thinks some Democrats overplayed the situation.
There are different meanings for different words for people that come from different places. And what is unfortunate is I don't think we have the patience, because of this racially charged environment we're in this country, to listen and get things in context before we jump to conclusions.
After the incident made national news, both Ortiz and Holtorf say they've been threatened.
Hate speech, death threats. It is unbelievable, all the words that would be used in response to the word buckwheat.
How lawmakers talk about race isn't just an issue of decorum. It's also come up in many policy debates this year, from criminal justice reform to health care and education, even with the state budget and the idea that Colorado's spending should address long-standing inequities in society. Democratic Representative Jennifer Bacon says that's a good thing.
If this country made it a point for 200 of its 250 years to have laws that codified what race is, but also what people can't do because of their skin color, they codified it because it was supposed to have an impact and was supposed to shape some sort of outcomes here. Why do we think it didn't work? You know what I'm saying? And so we have to be intentional in undoing that.
Bacon has met privately with a number of Republicans after they've said things she found concerning or upsetting. She wants to try to help them see her perspective. Bacon says when colleagues say systemic racism doesn't exist, it invalidates her own life experience.
When I walk into a room, some people see black before they even know what my name is. The reason why we talk about it is because it happened to us, you know? And it happened to a lot of people here. So when they say you're trying to divide, you are denying who I am. That is why it's painful.
But many Republicans say Democrats are calling too many things systemically racist to advance their own policy positions and silence opponents.
That really bothers me. It breaks my heart, frankly, because we have enough challenge, just Republicans and Democrats and libertarians and so on, finding the common ground to make this a great place to live.
Representative Mark Baisley says it's divisive when Democrats blame problems on white supremacy.
Most of us white folk are just going, well, what? Why is that applied to me? I don't apply that to me. I don't behave that way. I don't think that way. That's an offense in and of itself.
Navigating one of the most contentious issues in American society has strained some working and personal friendships at the Capitol. But some are trying. A few days after Representative Holtorf called Ortiz buckwheat, the two went to a cigar bar to talk. Both are combat veterans and flew helicopters in the Army. Ortiz says it's a bond that's important to them.
Anybody that served in the military is family to me. And we all have family members that will get up and embarrass us from time to time. And again, this is not trying to excuse any of it. I mean, it's so multifaceted when it comes to, I want what's best for him on a personal level. I want him to learn and grow from this so that we don't have to do this. I want that for the institution too, because we're supposed to represent the best in our communities.
And a few days later, Holtorf and Ortiz were back on the House floor. But this time, they were sitting side by side, advocating for a bill they were both sponsoring. I'm Bente Birkeland, CPR News.
I think topics, I think the whole issue that this story was about will come up again, for sure. So someone had a quick question, how has COVID impacted my job? Let's see, well, I think, do you just mean logistically or just how we cover things, or?
Yeah, Bente, this is John. It seems to me that many things have changed due to COVID. Relationships with neighbors, going in and out of stores wearing masks, delays getting car repairs done, delays getting home repairs done. Seems like everything has been pushed back. And I just wonder how that has impacted your routine with Colorado Public Radio.
I'd say at first, on the beat I'm on, it was tough because everything's done remotely. And they were kind of shifting to remote work, remote meetings. And a really big part of one of the few places maybe that's supposed to be a deliberative in-person experience, it's the state legislature. And you lose so much by not being there in person. And lawmakers have so many meetings and Zoom things that should be public but aren't. And so there's a lot less transparency and access to information. For the most part, yes, a lot of CPR has been remote. I really just put my mask on and still did the job I had to do. So I was covering the last election. So going out and talking to voters, just wore my mask. And I was one of the people that was still out and about the most, I would say, talking to people on the ground, being back at the Capitol. But things are, it's not different than the larger society. It's very tense. People are so fed up with, that we're not through the pandemic, and so many people have had personal hardships. And I was talking about mental health challenges, and it just goes on, and everyone's situation is different. Lawmakers are experiencing that too. We definitely did stories. There was angry fights about who's going to wear a mask where, and some people refuse to wear masks, and they're not enforcing that at the Capitol for lawmakers. I just saw in another state, I think it was New Jersey, lawmakers have to be vaccinated or get a COVID test to get in, and Republicans weren't doing that. And so they were like banned from the Capitol. Anyway, it's playing out in New Jersey, I think, right now. Democrats in Colorado didn't want to remove people from the floor or do anything like that, but it changed things. I think this next session will be more normal. I mean, people will wear masks if they choose to, but it's not as deliberative. It's, it's just a more tense time as things continue. And granted, the breakneck speed of news was, I think, shocking for all of us, just how quickly things are changing. And we did a couple really, I think, nice kind of day in the life stories with Governor Polis early on in the pandemic when he was shutting everything down and signing all the executive orders. They let me shadow him and see what it was like behind the scenes. And so I was really glad I was able to do that story of kind of what it was like to be a little part of what it's like to be a governor in such unprecedented times. And then we did a follow-up a year later. So, but this next session, I'll be at the Capitol every day in person and just have my mask on and kind of hope we don't have some big outbreak or anything there.
Thanks for doing your job.
What's the name of the story that you mentioned about the governor?
I don't know. I can post that.
Sure.
I don't know if you'd want the year out.
Yeah, just how to find it. And Bud has his hand up, but I just wanted to make a comment that David had posted a question in the chat.
That's cool.
But I think Bud might be leaving soon. So Bud, do you have a question?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you. I can see why you've won so many wonderful awards. You deserve them. My question has to do with whether or not you and other journalists have taken to heart, I think, the wonderful statement from a former longtime editor of the Boston Globe when he said a free press is the guardian angel of democracy. And given the Trump era where he must have repeated 10,000 times the fake news syndrome and phenomenon, have you done with your colleagues, are you focusing how to overcome that mistrust now that is rampant in our culture?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can only, it's so much bigger than any one individual. So we just focused on being, on being transparent. We've always tried to do this. Be honest, don't over surprise sources. Check back with people as many times as you need as you're quoting them, sending people stories. I think it is really hard. The rhetoric it's kind of become a reality, and of what a lot of people think. And I have noticed that when I talk to some people that you have to work harder to build their trust in a way. You have to prove yourself a little bit more than maybe you did prior. And it's kind of like people are very skeptical, regular people, just because they've heard so much of fake news and media is the enemy. I've covered a lot of election disinformation stories. Dominion Voting Systems, which is the company at the epicenter of all the election with stolen claims, because Georgia uses Dominion. They're headquartered in Denver. Some of their Colorado employees have been directly impacted by that. There's some defamation lawsuits now in Denver District Court suing the Trump campaign and Rudy Giuliani and all of those folks. So that's playing out as a news story here. But I just think for journalists, we just have to keep doing the best job we can to be transparent and thorough and honest and accurate, and send those usually Republican or conservative sources our stories. But on things like the election was stolen, it's tough because the facts don't support that. So for a lot of the policy stories I cover, there are various perspectives that, they're not necessarily wrong. It's just a different way of people looking at an issue. Whether someone, whether it's the death penalty or immigration policies, or there's a whole host of things that, people may disagree and say you're wrong, but it's coming at it from a different angle. But with the election stuff and the fake news narratives, it's harder when the facts aren't there and the audits show one thing and the data shows one thing. We have to point that out, even though if that feeds into their narrative of us, the fake media, that's where it makes it really tough.
Great. Well, thank you very much. That's a comprehensive response.
given the fact that the facts don't support those things, why is that not called a lie? Right? I mean, if the facts are one thing, but the narrative is something else, right? When I was a little kid, at one point I told my parents I brushed my teeth, and they showed the fact that my toothbrush was dry, and they told me, "Kid, you're lying to us. You did not brush your teeth. That is a lie." Right? The fact was I hadn't brushed my teeth, right? My alternative fact was that I said that I had, but that was a lie, right?
Yeah. And
So why does the media not say you are lying, right? The fact is the election wasn't stolen, right? We've got a bunch of audits that prove that the election wasn't stolen. You people that are saying that the election was stolen are lying.
I think, I mean, some outlets do say that. I don't know if we do as much. I mean, usually we will just say, we will point out why it's a lie. You know, so sometimes we do say, like, I think we more likely say that's false or it's not true. I don't know, I may have used lie, but then following out of that, as far as kind of what I was saying about being transparent, you know, the audits show no discrepancy, the audits show that no votes were flipped. You know, we put the facts in there that back up our fact and how we know that this is not true.
Right, but the persons that are saying that it's a fraud, that are saying that the election was stolen, are perpetuating a fraud, right? They, in fact, are the ones that are trying to steal the election, right?
Yeah, and I think what makes well, I think so many Coloradans do believe this, you know, not a huge number, but a lot more than we may realize of just kind of regular people, based on their news and stuff. So, you know, how do we share their perspectives, but putting that in the right context? You know, we don't want to amplify things, but at the same time, we don't want to ignore the reality on the ground of what's brewing or what a lot of people may believe is true.
Well, we're getting kind of far afield of
Yeah.
an employment group, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
How about you tackle David's question? Maybe David could say it to you himself.
Sure.
And then we can move on.
My question is, climate change adaptation and mitigation involve job creation, which we would hope would be of bipartisan interest. However, it would appear that climate legislation this session will be more in the background in an election year. What are the prospects for bipartisan climate legislation that leads to avoiding the cost of disaster while creating enduring, well-paying jobs?
Yeah, I don't know, actually. I may ask one of my colleagues who's focused on that. I think that'd be a good thing to look into.
Yeah, you're gonna have a little brother. That's so exciting.
I don't know how much it will be in the back burner or not. I think there is some bipartisan support around the job creation aspect, but a lot of the climate stuff does get also, as you know, tied up into the partisan politics. So I don't know. I guess I'd have to look into that to see what they're going to do on that front. I'd be surprised if there wasn't anything on the agenda, especially with the workforce and job creation kind of focus of the session. I know that a lot of the money coming in, and it may not necessarily be new money, but a lot of the federal COVID relief money, it's one-time money. So they're trying to set up things that will be sustainable and won't put the state on the hook financially for something Colorado can't afford in the future. So, so yeah, I wish I had an answer to that. I don't know. Well, we'll have to report that out and get back to you because
you have a glow too, Maddie.
Yeah.
And how have you seen the resiliency of Coloradoans change over your reporting time? I mean, with the pandemic, with changing of administrations, sometimes I feel like all of the issues that we're dealing with have been there all along, and now they've just been highlighted. So have you found people more resilient than before, or is there a low minority of people that just seem to be the loudest?
That's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I kind of agree that are these new issues, or is it just things are highlighted? I think it's been really tough when people have lost a sense of community or part of their normal routines that they used to do. And it's hard to make up for that, especially for, I think, the youth that have kind of, I don't want to say have been neglected, but you're never going to get to be a 7th grader again or an 8th grader again, or think of all the kids who are looking forward to this, making a team or something in your senior year of high school, or, all these things that were kind of taken away. That's the group I think, how are they going to be resilient, and how is this going to impact them as adults in terms of how they get through this and what supports are in place. One thing I have noticed when I've been out talking, and this isn't necessarily to Trent's question, but when I've talked to voters from across the political spectrum, just kind of big picture issues like what's on your mind, what are you worried about? The one thing I've been noticing is, through the pandemic and recently, everyone has brought up almost independently that they don't like how toxic the country is right now, and how kind of, I don't want to say mean things are, but just, the tone. And so I see that as an encouraging thing, that a lot of people aren't happy with the situation. They don't, I'm sure, agree on who's to blame and what the solution is, but just even agreeing that there's a problem can help you potentially find a solution. Because like when it comes to the voting fraud thing, there wasn't voter fraud. So for people who think there was voter fraud, how do you deal with that? Like, how do you have a solution there? And a lot of these things, whether it's, weather, climate disasters and behavioral health and a lot of other issues of the Capitol, people can agree on, hey, there's a fundamental thing we need to work on here. So I don't know. I guess I don't have an answer of how resilient people have been. I think lawmakers have been pretty resilient as individuals. And things have stayed on track as much as they can. We'll see how this next session goes, but I think this next session is going to be very, very tough with all the political dynamic in play and all the different motivations people are going to have to act in a certain way. And given the lack of sleep, the late nights, and just strong personalities, different personalities all kind of together, we've had those challenging sessions, and I kind of think this will be one of them, but I guess I don't know. And then someone was asking about bridging the gaps between the parties. I mean, I think the heated debates can't really be avoided on big issues. People disagree, but I think the more you can just, it doesn't even have to be going out for drinks, but just have a casual aside conversation with someone in the chamber can kind of make you see someone more as a person and more as a full person beyond what their politics are. If you think of family members you may disagree with politically, but you can set that aside and appreciate the other things you love about them. Kind of, it sounds cheesy, but focusing on some of the things where you may agree with someone or things that you like about them or that they contribute can make you disagree in a way that's much more productive and not toxic. Because if it does get really toxic, like with that buckwheat story, it can derail everything. And if other things like that come up, it just, one thing spirals into the next. Everyone expects in an open debate with the legislative process is about disagreement. So it's like, how do they go about doing that in a way that's productive? And I think there's a lot of lawmakers in both parties that keep that in mind, and they do, they want it to be successful. So I think being in person with each other does help, because you get to see more sides of people and maybe interact with them beyond just a fiery debate on an issue.
Thank you.
Bente, do you have anything else to talk about, or do you want to generally open?
No, I don't really. I mean, we have a podcast. If anyone listens, it's called Purplish. It comes out once a week during session where we just do just a little bit more analysis, and it's maybe 15 minutes or so. It's on the website, or if you can get it on your phone too. And yeah, I think I'll just be covering all these topics, and also definitely election disinformation and what's going on with the security breach in Mesa County, which we didn't talk about. That's not really a legislative story, but a big political story. I'm doing something on that in the next day or two. I was in Grand Junction not long ago. So Colorado is at the epicenter of a lot of things, always. It's just funny to me, is like, we're not the most populated state, but it's kind of security, election integrity. It's like, well, we're not Georgia, we're not Arizona, like Democrats won here. I remember thinking after 2020, like, we're not going to be involved in the election disinformation story. And lo and behold, we're kind of at the epicenter with the Mesa clerk and Dominion being here. And so I think even though we may not be a swing state, I think the 8th congressional district will be important. So there's going to be a lot of kind of fun, interesting, I don't know if fun's the right word, but worth knowing about, I think, stories coming out of Colorado in the next year.
Great. If you can post the link to the Purplish, David's asking about that, and I was going to bring that up myself.
Okay.
That would be great. By the way, so if you don't have anything to keep more in your formal presentation, I would say let's open it up to general questions. I had one related to the Colorado Resiliency Office. Do you know about them much?
I don't. I mean, I've heard of it, but no.
You didn't cover any legislation related to them?
What was that created? Was it last session?
I don't know the exact date. They've been around for
A couple
at least
years.
a couple of years, I would say.
Yeah, I don't think I have. No.
They do a little bit with individual resiliency. They focus more on group community resiliency, governmental organization or community resiliency, things like that. Just wanted to note that they have a summit on January 20th, the Resiliency Summit. If anyone's interested, I'll put the link to that to sign up for that summit for anyone interested. And did Bente, did you come across any resources, added resources, books, articles related to resiliency that you could suggest?
I'll have to think about that. Not explicitly. As it ties to the legislature, maybe?
Well, resiliency and in general, and also about the legislature, things which are moving related to resiliency, related to mental health, related to other aspects such as that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing with the mental health will be this $500 million federal dollars, and getting that into programs and talking about kind of increasing the workforce that can provide services for people who need mental health support. So I think that's what are the bottlenecks in the current system for access, for getting support, for taking those preventative measures.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something I will be covering. I don't really have any, reading materials or anything I can suggest.
Just as a moment to suggest some things or to point something out. This is probably the best book I found, Resilient by Rick Hansen. He's kind of a fairly popular author. And Resilient, How to Grow an Unshakable Core of Calm, Strength and Happiness would be one. Another book is the Resiliency Workbook by Dr. Glenn R. Schiraldi, hard name to pronounce. Those are probably the two books, best books on resiliency I've come across. And let's see. Does anybody have any questions? Trent?
Yeah, one of the, given that this is a job seekers network, one of the things that I think will help folks stay resilient is hopefulness, right? Can you, it may not be your beat, but given the fact that you're kicking around the Capitol and the Build Back Better bill is, hopefully, coming about, do you have any information about the monies that may be coming into Colorado and how that may impact job availability, programs that are going to be coming online, et cetera, that may impact the employment picture and therefore, the job prospects and impact people's, employment, prospects, and therefore their hopefulness and, help them stay more resilient in terms of their employment picture.
Yeah, I mean, I know as of right now, the state's trying to put some money into alleviating, and I don't know if this will make what type of difference this will make, but the fees for the paid family leave program, and then unemployment insurance that businesses are paying so they don't see a huge spike in rates there. I think the goal of that is, like, to your point, to alleviate some of the pressure that businesses are still facing. And I haven't covered this, but they have nationally, and I think we would do more of it locally on just kind of what's going on with labor and employment. And I know there's a lot of shortages, but I don't know if the people seeking, if it quite fits into those areas of the shortages. So all I can say at this point is I know it's going to be a big focus of the session. The economy and they have a task force specifically looking at workforce and kind of job creation. Now, Republicans will say that's not the role of government to create jobs. So, we'll see what they come up with. But the two things I know off the top are the unemployment insurance and paid family leave fees for employers.
Okay, again, I know this may not be your exact beat, but have you heard, like Colorado, we have a lot of federal labs. Have you heard about monies that are going to be flowing into those labs that may result in new jobs by chance?
I haven't, but
okay,
we can look into that. Yeah, I haven't.
Okay.